Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interactions with the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Area Interreligious Ministries in cooperation with KNVA. Join us now for Austin Faith Dialogue.
Are you ready for the holidays? I'm Carl Gronberg, host of Austin Faith Dialogue, and we thank you for being with us because on this edition of our program, we want to talk about you and about me and about the holidays. I'm dressed appropriately because in my tradition, it's all about Advent now. We're waiting, preparing, looking forward to 12 days of the Christmas festival, but during these days, we hopefully anticipate. And on this edition, this program of Austin Faith Dialogue, we're going to talk about how do we survive all of this in the holidays. And I have with me two of the most wonderful people you're going to meet. They're from Hospice Austin. Sarah, welcome. Glad to have you here. And David, thank you.
Thank you.
Matter of fact, David, you made me feel so good off camera. You said you actually watched the program a few times. Is that right?
That's correct.
So we know there's at least one viewer out there watching the program. So
There's
on
many
behalf
viewers.
of all of us, we say thanks for watching Austin Faith Dialogue. It is the holiday time in our culture, in our community. I don't know, coming to the station, the lights, you know, on Congress Avenue. I'm getting ready for the Trail of Lights. Have you ever gone to the Trail of Lights? Isn't that a neat experience to have? And in our tradition, we get ready for the special foods that my wife prepares and the family. And how about all of you? Sarah, you're of the Jewish community, getting ready for Hanukkah and those kinds of things.
Next week, yes.
Yeah, it'll be a special time. And David, you're of the Buddhist community.
Yes, sir.
But you have a Roman Catholic background.
I was raised Roman Catholic, yes, and then, but I got interested in Buddhism as a kid. And just like in Christianity, you have Christmas and you have Hanukkah. In Buddhism, December 8th, we have Bodhi Day, which celebrates the Buddha's enlightenment.
Oh, that is nice. So that's another celebration we can have during December.
That's right.
Well, all during the holidays, people are wanting to be joyful. That's a reality. They want to have joy, and yet I wanted you to be on the program because we recognize that within our community, there are those people who struggle with that whole theme of joy and happiness and parties and celebration because they have grief and they've had sorrow. I'd like you to talk to our Austin Faith Dialogue viewing family and talk a little bit about that. You are with the bereavement coordinator. Tell us about what that means.
I coordinate the bereavement department, and we do support groups and individual counseling for bereaved individuals. And so we're doing a program called Surviving the Holidays to help people with this time because it is really hard for a lot of people.
And David, you work with Hospice Austin, and what is your thought about this whole experience of dealing with the conflicting views? Because everything around is saying be happy and joyful, and yet they're dealing with this very significant loss in their life.
Right. Well, it's such a good question because just in general, our society, I think especially compared to other societies, unfortunately, we're a very death-denying society. And so when people are grieving a loss, maybe they've lost a parent or a sibling or a child, but they've lost a loved one, it's always hard. But around the holidays, that's particularly true because kind of like you were saying, the holidays are supposed to be a time when we're up and we're happy, and there's so many religious holidays and personal family traditions. And then there's just the stress of the holidays, putting up the lights, getting gifts, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So the busyness combined with other people, at least the seeming appearance of happiness, that contrast can be particularly acute. And people often don't want to listen to your grief anyways, unfortunately, and so then around the holidays, that's particularly true.
Do you find, Sarah, that people want to talk about their grief during the holidays? Do you find that if they can find a community of people, maybe their friends who are celebrating, going to parties, don't want to hear, as David said, their grief, but can they find a group of people, and how does Hospice Austin help in that area?
Well, I think it's really important to find a group of people because if you're keeping it all inside, it's going to affect you. And we have support groups, and I find them really beneficial and therapeutic because you're around a group of people that understand what you're going through, and there's a lot of shoulds that come with grief. You should be feeling better by now is one of them you often hear, and so you need to be with a group of people that aren't going to should you to death and just say, it's okay, I hear where you're coming from.
Those people, David, who are experiencing that sense of loss, that grief, where can they and how can they reach out, and how can Hospice Austin help them?
Well, kind of like, that's a great question. Kind of like Sarah was saying, we have support groups kind of going continuously. And one of the things we do, and Sarah heads this up, is we have kind of particular support groups. So we'll have support groups for, say, loss of spouse. But even within that, we try to have support groups for, say, loss of spouse for people who are under 40, and then 40 to 60, and then over 60. Because with each of those development stages in human consciousness, there are certain dynamics that are always the same when you lose your partner, but there are some that are different depending on your age. And then we'll have you know, a loss of sibling group, we have a survivors of suicide group, because the dynamics of each type of loss, they're the same but different. So we try to do individualized counseling, and we have counselors who specialize with children in grief, which is definitely kind of a particular type of loss. So we try to tailor our programs, and we even have a neat thing that we're really proud of called Camp Braveheart, which I guess this was our 9th year doing that. And Camp Braveheart, we always do it the second weekend in August, is that right? And it's a free camp that we put on, and you don't have to have lost, your loved one didn't have to die in our service. None of our programs, you have to be a Hospice Austin family. Even if you were with another hospice or not at hospice at all, you can still come to us. We just try to provide these services as a community resource. But Camp Braveheart, we have specially trained counselors and volunteers to work with kids who've lost a loved one. And it's a 3-day outdoor camp, and we have ropes course and canoeing, and it's very therapeutic and a lot of fun at the same time.
It sounds like it's life-affirming
It is.
in terms of all that they do, and yet I would imagine in that process of affirming life, they're also dealing with this significant loss.
Right.
And how does that happens in August, is what you said, right?
Correct.
The camp is in August. And then here we are in December, and we're dealing with all the other things. The mood has changed from August to December. The weather has changed,
That's right.
everything around us has
That's right.
changed, and yet there comes that emptiness. What about the bereavement groups? How do they, well, what are some stories, maybe, if you can tell any of those, of people who've come? I thought it was particularly interesting what you said about you deal with the age groups, that if of the 20s to 30s and 40s to 50s, is that what you said? And I think as a parish pastor, I look at people who've lost a significant person in their life when they're young, but then also those who have lost a partner who's been their partner for 60-some years.
Right.
And to deal, it's a loss nonetheless, and to be able to minister in that kind of experience. And that's my vocabulary, Sarah. There's ministry going on, and Hospice Austin is doing that ministry, which makes me think about you. How in the world did you find your way? Are you an Austinite?
No, I'm from Georgia, so I've come a windy path brought me here, but I'm a social worker by training, and in graduate school I took a course on loss and grief, and just really inspired me, and so that's what led me to Hospice Austin. So
How did that speak to you, that class on loss and grief? How did that touch you?
I guess I just see all kind of mental illness on a spectrum of loss. You know, depression is a loss of joy, as you know, anxiety is a loss of, you know, feeling calm and content. So I just thought, wow, this is just the farthest spectrum, you know, death. And you know, divorce is loss. There's a lot of different kinds of losses. So I just really enjoy the complexity of the topic.
And job loss. Can you imagine those during the holidays who have lost a job, and everybody's around there saying, let's have a good time,
Right.
and they're dealing with that terrible loss. So when we talk about loss, we're talking about death, but we're also talking about divorce, I heard you say, and we're also talking about job, and lots of the other experiences that we have in this human drama that we're engaged in.
Well, and that's a great point that Sarah made, because in a sense, everything is loss, even joyful things are losses. There's a saying in Buddhist philosophy, samsara and nirvana are one, which means that in all things, joy and suffering exist together. So even when you have something like you're married, and that's a joyful time, or you have a child, maybe you have a little loss of autonomy, or a loss of free time, or a loss of income, or more responsibility. With everything, there is joy and suffering together. And so I think one thing that we try to do in the bereavement department, one-on-one with individual counselors or group counseling, Camp Braveheart, these types of things, Surviving the Holidays, our upcoming program, we try and empower people so they can sit with both the joy and the suffering that is inherent in human existence. Because you can't shut either experience out of the human continuum. If you try and shut out joy, psychologically you're not going to experience, suffering. They both just go together.
To live in that tension
Yes.
is a part of the reality of being alive.
Mm-hmm.
To experience that type of loss is the word we've been using, but to surviving all of that. And you mentioned depression. How, depression comes when a person is going through the holidays and all around you go into stores and you hear all the carols being sung and all the things that are happening. And I think of all the religious experiences within our congregational community, everything is speaking about joy to the world,
Yeah.
the Lord has come, and then inside there's that emptiness.
Yeah.
How do you help people who are going through depression at this time to deal with that? And will the conference, and does the conference that you're having, does it deal with that type of experience?
Well, our program deals with, grief and the holidays, and grief and depression have a lot of similarities, especially in the initial stages of grief. So I do think we'll address kind of tactics and coping strategies, and some of those will be having a plan, acknowledging the holidays are going to be different this year. They're not going to live up to my past expectations, and so I need to adjust.
Well, let's stop right there, if I may, Sarah. Having a plan, then. So first of all, then we have to acknowledge,
Right.
that knowledge that the things are different. That whether it be divorce or whether it be the loss of a loved one or job or whatever it may be, things are different. But in order to do that, a person has to have a sense of a frame of reference.
Yeah.
That's not easy to do necessarily, is it?
No, especially when you have so many people saying, "Oh, you need to be happy this time of year," and so you feel that additional guilt. Well, why am I not feeling that way? So it's
Another layer of guilt.
Yeah. Yeah.
David, you are program director, is that correct?
Correct, sir.
So when you deal with programming, and you think about this program of a conference on surviving the holidays, what is your main goal? What are you thinking about as program director that you want to come out of that conference?
Well, at our program, for example, Surviving the Holidays, which is next Wednesday, is it the 5th? Is that right? From 7 to 9 at Hyde Park Christian Church. Yeah. But it's free and open to anyone in the community. And we have a panel of experts. We have a professor from UT, Chris Ford, and she'll be speaking on how to help children who are grieving and how to talk to children about grief and loss, because that's something, like a lot of times people don't want to talk about grieving in general, but they especially don't want to talk about it in relation to kids. I'll be... Oh,
Well, I want to interrupt
Sure,
because
please.
I interrupted Sarah,
no.
so I'm going to interrupt you, David.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Forgive me, but how do we talk to children then? Because that is a trauma for a child. The divorce is a trauma for a child, the job loss for the parents, the instability, the insecurities, all the stressors that go on at that time. But death certainly has to be. How do you talk to a child about during the holidays?
Well, that's a very good question. A couple things to just put out right up front that I think can be kind of helpful, because like we're talking about, I mean, death can be transformative, but it also obviously is very painful emotionally. And so again, with kids, that's particularly acute. But some things to keep in mind are, one, studies show that developmentally, a child who, say, loses a parent or a sibling, of course, I have a child myself, and you never want to see a child go through that kind of pain. And yet, at the same time, studies show that with proper support and intervention and nurturing, a child can actually grow up more whole, more emotionally and psychologically full and developed than their peers who did not face that kind of a loss.
So what I hear you saying, David, is that the child should be invited into the experience,
Yes.
not hidden from the experience.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Sarah, you agree with that?
Yeah, I think parents, shouldn't try to hide their tears, be open with their feelings. I think being open and honest with your child, using age-appropriate language, not using language like passed away or went to sleep, using concrete words. Your father died,
So we should not use the words passed away or
I think that's
went to sleep.
confusing to younger children.
And using what kind of words?
Died, concrete words, died, death, and kids are also very egocentric by nature, and so they automatically think, hey, I had something to do with this death. So assuring them that you didn't, people get sick, people die, and there's a lot
Accidents happen.
accidents happen, and there's a lot of really good books out there to kind of talk about the cycle of life and
Right.
explain it to kids.
But it's still tough.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that we try to protect them. And that whole process of denying death, you mentioned
Right.
that earlier. And yet what I hear you is saying is that not only does Hospice Austin say affirm life in August,
Right.
but affirm life in the holidays.
Absolutely.
And a part of that is recognizing that we're on a journey.
Yep.
I forget, Sarah, what did you say, that your path took a lot of turns in order to get where you are today? But couldn't we all kind of say the same thing, that this is the way life, and that's part of the celebration of life, wouldn't you
Yeah,
say, David?
that's right.
Who would have thought that this Roman Catholic boy would turn out to be a priest, a Buddhist priest?
That's correct. Yeah.
You know?
Everything changes.
And you said something else, David, that I thought was really interesting, is that maybe to know the fullness of life, we have to recognize the sorrows of life.
Absolutely.
And to be able to share that with children,
Yeah.
I think is important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, and in a similar vein, kids are tougher and smarter than sometimes I think we give them credit for. And so, similar to what Sarah was saying about talking with kids, like you were saying, inviting them in. If you don't, the flip side is I think sometimes, they can get the wrong message and they can develop guilt. They can think it's their fault. They can get all kinds of things in their head that aren't really true. So I think it's, in general, always invite children to make decisions, but I would encourage children in general to go to the funeral, go to the wake, that kind of thing, go to the graveside, take flowers to your grandmother, that kind of
Does
stuff.
it amaze you, Sarah, does it amaze you, David, that there are people who don't want the children to experience, they want to protect them from that? I remember when my mother died, and our oldest child, we went into what I guess you'd call the wake, but we call it a visitation in our tradition. And we stood at the casket
Yeah.
so she could experience and talk about Grandma. When you have this bereavement group that comes together, do you find, are children invited into that, or do you find that parents who want to say to their children, you're not responsible for the death of your sibling, or you're not responsible for the death of your loved one, but how about parents who themselves are dealing with their own guilt?
Yeah.
And how do they work through that?
It's really difficult. It's, and I kind of use the metaphor of being on an airplane and having the air bags drop down and they say put it on yourself first and then the child. The parent does really need to take care of themselves and make it a point to nurture themselves and find ways to replenish themselves as an example to the child.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that whole idea of taking care of oneself is a message that whatever faith community we're a part of is certainly a message for the holidays.
Absolutely.
That celebrate the religious rituals and all that go along with this, and the family rituals, if you will, but also in that process make certain they take care of themselves.
Right, right.
David, what do you think about adults who are dealing with, why is it that at a time of grief, if we're really going to survive the holidays and all of these memories and thoughts come rushing into us, how is it that parents can set an example or a tone, or grandparents for that matter, for the entire holistic approach to the family?
Well, I think one great model, a lot of times I talk to parents or grandparents who are, say, trying to help a child, and they'll say, well, I want to be really strong for my child, and that's good. You always want to be strong for your kids. But what they mean often when you probe, you ask them some questions, is they'll say, well, I want to cry in front of the kids. And I would actually encourage them to do just the opposite. Share your grief with your kids. Be open and honest and upfront about it. Don't try and hide it, because children are always going to look to their parents as an example. And if the parents are grieving in a healthy way, the kids will grieve in a healthy way. If the parents aren't grieving in a healthy way, then the kids will emulate that unhealthy model. And just one quick last point is that
I hope it's not your last point. We're going to keep going here. This is good, yeah. I'm enjoying it.
Me too. Is that, it takes a lot of bravery sometimes to cry. And especially for men, sometimes we're not taught how to share our emotions. And I think it can be a great, brave act to cry and in front of your children and with your children. And that lets them know that it's okay to cry too.
How do you help, Sarah and David, people who are not healthy in many dimensions of them? Not to point fingers, just to say that
Sure.
dealing with the fact that many of us are not healthy in our relationships, maybe not taking care of ourselves, and then the trauma comes, the sadness comes, the death comes, or the divorce, or whatever, loss of job, whatever the grief may be. And how do you help them to, if you will, you start out by saying you have to have a plan, but to have a plan you have to be thinking, you have to be able to think. how do you invite people to begin that thoughtful process, Sarah? And I know there's no magic formula, okay? I'm not asking for that, but if you have it, let us know, please, okay?
Right.
But how do we help people to grow into health so that they can deal with health in their living, Camp Braveheart, but also in their dying, that whole experience of humanity?
Well,
Pretty heavy question.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think at least at Hospice Austin, we reach out again and again to our families and say, you know, we're here, here's what we offer. And so we hope they'll open that door and come, you know, to us and use the support groups and use the individual counseling. But it's really hard to see someone you love struggling and not know how to help them. And so we also help people who are friends of those who are grieving to know like warning signs and reach out, and maybe they would be more likely to go get help if they hear it from a friend or a family member.
So surviving the holidays means that Hospice Austin is there, but
Absolutely.
also look at your network around you. Look at your friends and others. And what you're saying is that you're helping friends to become healthier resources. Is that a possibility?
Absolutely it is. And so like for our program that Sarah and I have designed for Surviving the Holidays, we'll have Chris Ford there, I'll be there, and I'm kind of speaking on different religious perspectives around end of life. We'll have Cecile Adam, who's a chaplain, and we'll be sharing her personal grief journey. And then we have another one of our professional counselors, Pierre, who will be talking about the differences, kind of the clinical differences between normal grief, which is a kind of complex word to use, versus kind of clinical depression, which is also kind of a complex term to use.
How do you
but-
divide those two, normal grief and clinical depression?
Well, that's a very good question. In the DSM, which is kind of what psychologists...
DSM.
Yeah, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Oh, my.
And that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is a mouthful. Well done, David.
I know. But traditionally, it's hard to kind of tease out the differences between grief and depression. A lot of times, both the emotional and even biological symptoms will be very similar. There'll be things like possibly a loss of appetite, weight loss, difficulty sleeping, things like hopelessness, helplessness, feeling sad for a pronounced period of time. Now, when you lose someone you love, of course you're going to go through those things. Of course you may not want to go out of, get out of bed. You may not want to go to work, that kind of stuff. If you have those same symptoms for a long, pronounced period of time, particularly in an acute manner, the traditional school of thought, and there's actually some debate within the profession, but if those symptoms go on in an acute, profound way for a prolonged period of time, then you might really think about getting some professional support.
You know what I'm going to ask you, and you come
Yeah.
back to this, don't lose your train of thought, but
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you, you say length of time.
Right.
Now, I'm going to ask you, what is that length? And of course, it would be depending, right, on
Well,
whomever.
it's a little bit debatable. In the DSM, I believe the time length they look at is 2 months. But I'll tell you, a personal rule of thumb I like, there's a professor emeritus from, oh my goodness, New Mexico, and University of New Mexico, Robert Kastenbaum, and his rule of thumb is to look at how you're coping. In other words, there's not, and I think this is a more skillful approach, not so much a hard and fast time period, because someone who's Zen Buddhist, or someone who's Christian, or someone who's from East Asia, or someone who's from Africa, our cultural background will have a lot to do with our coping as well. What may look unhealthy in one culture may be completely healthy in another.
Exactly.
So I'm hesitant, and I think Sarah would probably agree with me, on kind of putting a firm timeline on things. I think a better approach is say, Dr. Robert Kastenbaum's approach, where he says, look at how you're coping. For example, are you able to take care of your kids? Are you still able to go to work?
Are you functioning?
Drinking? How is your functioning?
Right.
That's the key question, I think.
But Sarah, would you say, in response to
Yeah.
that, and that was really good, David, thanks. That helps me as a parish pastor, I want you to know, and helps me personally, but also in my ministry. But would you say grief is really a lifelong experience in some ways?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, when we experience a loss, it will always be a part of us. It might not be the raw, open wound that it is at the beginning, but it's a scar, and it's there. So it's a lifelong journey. And, I think during the holidays especially, even if you're coping well day to day, during the holidays, it might rip that scab right open and you might feel just as vulnerable and raw as you did at the beginning.
And Sarah, what if I feel that way? How should I deal with those feelings?
Well, I think you need to know yourself and maybe adjust the holidays to do what feels comfortable to you. I think that's the key word, because people will feel like, oh, I should go to this party, I should get presents, I should do the whole rigmarole that I do every year, but it might be healthy to adjust it slightly and say, okay, this year I'm going to do it a little more quiet, I'm going to take care of myself, I'm going to reach out to people that I know I can be myself around, and I'm not going to put pressure on myself to live up to expectations.
David, what I heard Sarah saying eloquently and beautifully is that take care of yourself.
Right.
And maybe that's the message that Hospice Austin and faith communities, as a matter of fact, could say to everyone in our community, take care of yourself during the holidays.
Right, absolutely. And whenever I talk with anyone on this subject, my take-home theme is always take care of yourself. Whether you're a professional or you're someone who's in the situation, take care of yourself. And in a sense, it's common sense, and you hear it all the time, but very few of us really do it.
And so it's all right to say no to some of the parties.
Yes.
It's all right to say no to some of the other things. But I would think, isn't there also a danger? Because the parties can put us in relationship with people, and there might be some artificiality to it, some laughter that is just kind of put on, to be honest with you. But to find people with whom you can share, and that's what
Right.
Hospice Austin is saying, is find some people, maybe stay home
Yeah.
and have some tea and visit and talk. Is that right?
Right.
Tell us about what you would say then to the Austin community in conclusion. How do we survive the holidays?
Well, for myself, I think it's a combination of a couple things. With any loss, particularly around the holidays, I think it's helpful to have some kind of either religious beliefs or personal philosophy that helps you. Then I think you need some kind of practice to put those beliefs or philosophy in practice. And then the third piece of the puzzle is I think you need a community that supports you in your practice and your philosophy. We're all interconnected.
Yes, we are. Sarah, what about you?
I think rituals, and they're often linked to religious communities, but even if it's just lighting a candle at the dinner table or hanging a stocking and writing a note and putting it in that stocking,
That's a good idea.
they serve a purpose,
Sure,
especially
for the
this
loved
time
one
of
who's
year.
gone. Yeah,
And cherishing those memories.
Yeah, cherishing. David, thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
so
much.
much.
Great to have you in Awesome Faith Dialogue. And
Yeah.
Sarah, thanks for getting all of this together. And you do wonderful ministry. And on behalf of all of us in the Austin community, thanks to all of you for what you do.
Thank you.
And we wish for you who are with us in Awesome Faith Dialogue that as we begin this joyous and stressful, this time of all kinds of complexity and feelings, that for you and for those you love, that there might be always that sense of hope, that sense of anticipation, and that sense of inclusivity with the people you love. Thanks for being with us in Awesome Faith Dialogue, and remember, you can survive the holidays. Peace be with you.